Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Common Hearth. This is a monthly gathering at First Parish in Milton, Unitarian Universalist, where we explore topics of current interest and some controversy often, and invite conversation, knowing that most of the vexing issues of our time are timeless issues and ones that we want to be in conversation about, not just intellectually, but personally and spiritually. This evening we're talking about immigration, and we know that it has been a subject of much controversy in our nation over many years, but especially in the past year as Arizona has passed the Senate Bill 1070, correct? And other states are quickly following suit with other legislation in the works to limit immigration and limit rights of people who are here without documentation. Our faith is one that holds deeply that we humans are all one, whether we consider ourselves one as children of the same Creator God, or one in the fact that we come from the same source biologically. We are connected, and we know that this is a fact spiritually and in the physical world. The question then becomes, how do we acknowledge that and live it fully in this world with our other theological stance, which says that we all share the same destiny, that we are all bound for salvation in some way through the love of an infinite universe. It might be a creator God, again, or it might be just an infinite spirit that holds us all. How do we reconcile the fact that there is so much divisiveness over our differences, so many apparent needs to draw lines when we feel that we are one beginning and end of our lives? How do we make sense of that, and how do we position ourselves as people of faith given all of the great tensions of our time? So that's the question before our religious community. We've invited folks from beyond our faith tradition to speak to this issue, and our speakers tonight are, I'll just introduce them by name, and then they're going to give fuller introductions of themselves and their work. Gabriel Camacho, who comes to us from the American Friends Service Committee, and is on the front lines of this work around the current immigration legislation, and works with immigrant communities locally, correct? Ruth, who is an immigrant from Eritrea, who came as a refugee and is currently living in Milton, is that correct? And will share her experience of traveling to this country and working to become a resident here. And Kye Flannery, who is a student at Harvard Divinity School and has been an activist around the most recent phase of immigration reform. So I welcome all of them. Let's just give them a hand. Thank you. And we're hoping that, the format for the evening is that each of our panelists will speak for a few minutes, share their experiences, and then we will just open for conversation. Our hope in the conversation time is that we are able to be learners together. And that means that we own the fact that we each have wisdom and that we each have much to learn, and make space for that fact in one another. That we engage respectfully in conversation, and I will be the arbiter of what is respectful conversation. And we'll ask that people reconsider or rephrase if that becomes necessary. But I trust that everyone is here in the spirit of respect and the desire to grow both in faith and in education. So with that, I'm going to ask Ruth to begin by telling us a bit of her story.
That's from me?
Yeah.
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Ruth Worrede. First, I would like to say thank you to each and everyone for inviting me, welcoming me to this important panel discussion. I would like to tell you a little bit about the background, the general picture of the country where I come from. I came to United States 1984. end of 83. I came first in Los Angeles, California. I went through many ups and downs, difficulties, to get my residency or where I am today. And the problem is continuing, starting way back and still till today, it's increasing. I'm fortunate and I'm very lucky to be here. May God bless America. I get to learn, to work, and to be, where I am right now. I got married in 1992, and I have 3 children. I live in Milton. I came from Los Angeles to Boston for education. My husband was in this area. We're from the same country. I was born and raised in Ethiopia, but originally I'm from Eritrea. My family fled when they were young and lived in Ethiopia. I came from Ethiopia way back as a refugee and went through a lot of ups and downs, and I get my green card now. I'm a citizen of United States, and I feel I'm American now, and I feel bad, and for those people less fortunate, for my people, they are fleeing right now. I wrote some short background of Eritrea so that people can know. Eritrea is a country in the Horn of Africa. The capital is Asmara. It is bordered by the Sudan in the west, Ethiopia in the south, and Djibouti in the southeast. The northeast and east of the country have an extensive coastline on the Red Sea, directly across from the Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Eritrea has a small size with an estimated population of 5 million. The strategic importance of Eritrea due its Red Sea coastline was the main cause for the federation with Ethiopia, which led to its annexation to Ethiopia in 1952. The lack of regard for the Eritrean population led to the formation of independence movement, which took 30 years of fighting, which ended in 1991. Following UN supervised referendum, Eritrea gets its independence in 1993. Eritrea is a single-party state. Ratified constitution has yet to be implemented. In 1998, a border dispute with Ethiopia led to war and rebuilt in 100,000 days from both sides. Eritrea's relation with its neighbors have been strained due to its a series of wars and disputes. The government's human rights records remained poor, and authorities continued to commit numerous serious abuse, such as torture and beating prisoners, arrest and torture of national service evades, very terrible prison conditions, no freedom of speech, association, or no freedom of religion. That's why many people till today are fleeing. I'm so lucky now where I am. And I met some people. It so happened we met with Cynthia, and I told her about our stories. She was saddened by this, and she came to visit our center. We have a small center right now in Boston, Eritrean Community Center, because they are enormous. They're fleeing now, some legally, some illegally. It's not, they don't come here to kill, to rob. They just want to have a better tomorrow, because life and death there. So right now we're fortunate. Many of them got an opportunity with the help of the aid. They are here, and the refugee status process, they give them aid and help. They support them with housing and food, and some of them try to go to school. But many of them lack of schooling, lack of, they're old, they have a hard time to adjust their life here. What we are trying, those seniors, those people who've been here before them, we're trying to support. We're trying to show them, it's a long time, because we speak our language, we're trying to make them feel comfortable. Due to their frustration, for some of them get suicide, some of them no hope of life. So that's what you're here today to hear, and thank you very much. Any questions?
I think we'll do questions after for everyone, if that's okay. So, Gabriel, would you like to?
Sure. Good evening, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Gabriel Camacho. I was born in the South Bronx of Latin American immigrants. My father first came to this country in the 1940s at Parisa, which was the largest guest worker program in the United States. And my mother fled Colombia in the 1950s in a civil war known as La Violencia. It lasted 10 years and took the lives of 200,000 civilians during the 1950s. I came around to working on human rights through a rather interesting path. I studied anthropology in Guatemala, and I was actually doing my archaeological fieldwork in El Quiche in 1979, and I witnessed the military occupation of El Quiche and some atrocities that occurred there by the military. Since then, I've dedicated my life to the promotion of human rights. I was a union activist shortly after I finished my studies, and after almost 2 decades of being a union contract negotiator, a union organizer, I started working for the American Friends Service Committee in a project known as Project Voice, which works with immigrant communities so that immigrants can know what their rights are and help organize immigrant-led community organizations and campaigns. What I want to do this evening is briefly review the state of immigrant rights in the United States, the state of the immigrant rights movement, if we can call it that, and end on a good note, because what I'm going to have to say at the very beginning is not very nice. First of all, there's a lack of political will in the United States to fix our broken immigration system. And it doesn't help when we hear from the media and politicians the toxic debate that is actually influencing policymakers in criminalizing immigrants and demonizing us. The liberal Obama administration and the prior Democratic-dominated Congress did nothing to alleviate the situation for the immigrant community. Proponents of comprehensive immigration reform, including the liberal New York Democrat Chuck Schumer, the liberal Illinois Democrat Luis Gutierrez, and the liberal New Jersey Democrat Melendez, all issued ideas on how to fix our broken immigration system. But it contained all of these proposals contained 4 pillars. 1 was further border militarization. 2 was workplace enforcement, and this not only included more workplace raids, but such programs as E-Verify, Social Security no-match letters, and I-9 audits. The 3rd pillar was a prolonged path to legal permanent residency, which included fines, fees, and proof of payment of taxes. And finally, the 4th pillar was a prolonged guest worker program, which was often conflated as legalization. Now, when the Democrats dominated the Congress, there was only one piece of immigration legislation passed. Does anybody recall what that was? It was in 2006. It was called the Secure Fence Act, which poured millions of dollars of tax money into what's called a virtual fence. It was very recently, as a matter of fact, 3 months ago, that Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, called the virtual fence a failure. So here we have, in order to look tough on illegal immigration, we're pouring our tax dollars in a boondoggle for private corporations that help build this high-tech fence. The other immigration reform bill, if I can call it that, was passed at the end of last year. Does anybody recall what it was called? Okay, very similar to the first one I mentioned, the Southwest Border Security Act, which poured $600 million to the construction of a fence along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think someone's going to be talking about border issues and border militarization, so I'll leave it at that. With the current Obama administration, we have what I call an enforcement-only regime, in which the highlight was to implement smart enforcement to differentiate itself from the Bush-style military workplace raids. And these included the expansion of and implementation of 287G agreements. 287G agreements are where ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, trains local police officers in the identification, apprehension of undocumented persons. We also have another enforcement program called Operation Community Shield, which is designed to identify immigrant gang members and or gang associates, whatever that means. And finally, one program that you may be hearing about quite a bit in the news is Secure Communities, which is a database sharing program. When anybody is arrested and booked in a local jurisdiction, not only do their fingerprints get sent to the FBI, but if a jurisdiction signs on to Secure Communities, the FBI sends that over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement database, and if there's a hit, Immigration and Customs Enforcement can ask for the local jurisdiction to hold that person. The problem with this program, however, is that although the stated goal is to apprehend the most violent felons around, quite the opposite has occurred. The biggest demographic of persons deported under Secure Communities are people that have no criminal records whatsoever. Another problem that we identified in the AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, is that you really don't have an immigrant rights movement. For the most part, well-funded Beltway advocacy organizations adopted an uncritical policy towards these comprehensive immigration reform bills that I mentioned previously, and adopted a narrow legislative strategy solely focused on managing the immigrant community towards lobbying efforts. And after 6 years, the strategy failed miserably. And the net effect that it had within immigrant communities was that it left a sentiment of fear, of resignation, and disappointment with these Beltway organizations. But I'm going to end with on a bright note. What is the future of the immigrant rights movement? Well, many of you have heard or may be involved in the New Sanctuary movement. And this is where faith-based activism concentrates on accompaniment, witness, and solidarity of what immigrant communities are going through. There's also the establishment of workers' centers. And these are places within the immigrant community where undocumented workers who go through what's called wage theft, the non-payment of overtime, the non-payment of minimum wage, and outright not being paid at all, can go and learn about their labor rights and campaign to redress those workplace grievances. And these worker centers are happening in places like Centro Presente in Somerville, the Chelsea Collaborative in Chelsea, Massachusetts, Chinese Progressive Association in Boston. Another great example of what's happening at the grassroots level, again, is with youth organizing. Some of you have heard of this student immigrant movement in Massachusetts that was advocating for the DREAM Act. Also, in Massachusetts, when certain senators added anti-immigrant amendments to the budget, to the Massachusetts budget, these young students formed a coalition called Mass Hope 2010, which did a lot of grassroots organizing, lobbying at the State House, and also they did an encampment outside of the State House for 18 days. And it was quite dramatic, it was creative and very effective. Another sign of hope is that immigrants themselves, immigrant organizations, have formed their own institutions and organizations, such as NALAC, the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, which is made up of scores of immigrant-led organizations throughout the country. And not only are they trying to affect policy at the national level, but also understand why immigrants must make that horrible decision of leaving your family, your community, and your country. This is not a casual decision that many people make. Indeed, if you know the trials and tribulations that immigrants make, crossing borders, crossing through Mexico and into the Arizona desert, it's not something that's done very easily. And NALAC, the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, tries to pinpoint what is the reason that people must leave. What is the push factor? In the 1980s, we had the Central American Wars. I can tell you statistics of how many people died because the Reagan administration was intent on imposing that administration's political will in Central America. We also have so-called free trade agreements like NAFTA, which pretty much destroyed the local economies, especially in agriculture, in Mexico, forcing small producers off their farms to seek jobs elsewhere, including in the United States. There are other campaigns that I can talk about, but one that you may know about are the May Day mobilizations that occurred throughout the United States. And these are grassroots efforts designed to recapture the internationalist spirit of workers uniting across industry lines, immigration status, gender, race, and nationality. Because indeed, if we are going to fix this, it's going to come from the immigrants community. It's going to come from people mostly affected by these policies. And these are the voices and testimonies that Project Voice tries to lift up. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm Kye Flannery, and I am a Unitarian Universalist, and I go to school at Harvard Divinity School, where I'm planning to become a minister. And just this is a little bit more of a personal story. It's not sort of overarching policy stuff, because I don't know that much about the intricacies of policy. But I do know that I did a master's degree in American Studies, which taught me a lot about immigration history in the United States, and really reading books that actually told me our history was part of what made me attentive to these issues. Part of the thing that made me recognize that maybe this was something that ought to drag me out of my house on like a Saturday afternoon, you know, when I might be watching Pride and Prejudice for the 18th time. So one of the things that drew me to, so Standing on the Side of Love is an organization that's part of the Unitarian Universalist Church that is, it engages in political issues in a way that I can stand behind, in that it really seeks to relate to people as people and seeks to unite rather than divide. And so I've found that to be really helpful in thinking about questions like LGBT rights or immigration rights. And so a group of Standing on the Side of Love folks was going to Phoenix over the summer to basically there were a lot of grassroots organizations in Phoenix, immigrant-led organizations and Unitarian Universalist organizations, who were really upset by State Bill 1070, and they needed help. And so we went in there to, on the first day that this bill was supposed to be enacted, we went in there to stand with them and to sort of be a voice for immigrants, a pro-immigrant voice. And also anti-racist voice, for that matter, because part of the issue there, the big issue there, as I saw it, was that people were being approached based on the color of their skin, based on appearing illegal, which is a really confusing idea to me. I don't know how that works. So I basically I was listening to the radio the week before this bill was supposed to go into effect, and it was a national show, and this guy called in the show and said, "I don't know why we have any tolerance at all for undocumented people. They're murderers. I know people who've been killed by undocumented people." And I kept waiting for the talk show host to interject and say, "Sir, that's not really a fair connection to make, or we can't pin murder on a particular group of people. This is not a crime that's uniquely an undocumented problem, certainly." And that never happened. That intervention never happened. They just sort of slid by it and was like, that was allowed to stand out there in this public way on the radio. This thing that this guy said was, and so the problem, as I saw it, was that kind of discourse was going out and nobody was combating it. And I realized that I really needed to try and combat it. So I called my church, and they were able at the last minute to help me with funding get to Phoenix to be part of this protest. It was a day of non-compliance, where if they approached you to show your papers, that you wouldn't be carrying any. So that, and the idea was, I mean, frankly, as a white person, to go and stand in solidarity with Latin American people or Latinos or people who felt threatened by this law. And that as you use, particularly as a pretty white denomination, that we actually had some power there to throw around, that we had some power to say, hey, if you want to mess with these folks, you have to mess with us, and let's see if you're willing to do that. So that was a very powerful experience for me as a Unitarian, as a person involved in politics, to see people from my church going and really testing themselves, being out there, and it was 120 degrees out there in July when we were there, and there were just people my mom's age and people my grandma's age, and these really strong women and men who sort of put me to shame a little bit as a 30-year-old person, and it really moved me to see our church out there in that way. And yeah, I spoke to a woman and her son there, who she talked about living in a largely Latino neighborhood. And her son talked about just going to play basketball. And when he wore a particular hoodie, he would always get stopped by the police in the street because he looked threatening, because he was Latino and wearing a hoodie. And so to be able to just think about what that meant, to walk down the street and be policed in an active way, and that's something that I don't experience in Cambridge. It's not where I live. I live in Dorchester. It's something I don't experience in Dorchester. It's something that other people experience in Dorchester, but not me. As a white woman, regardless of whether I wear a hoodie or not, whether or not I play basketball. So seeing those stories one-on-one, face-to-face, and being able to talk to people who are having these experiences was very formative for me. It really mattered. And so I decided to go back to Arizona in January with a school group. We went to Tucson this time, and we ended up there about a week after Gabriel Giffords was shot. So it was just this really tense, crazy time. But I realized that it sort of is tense and crazy a lot in Arizona right now. There's just a lot of really high emotion around the issue of immigration. And we got to visit northern Mexico and a place called Nogales, which is a city. It's a city that's split down the middle. Half of it is in Arizona, and half of it is Nogales, Sonora, which is in Mexico. And so you can stand in the same city and you look across the border, and the wealth disparity is the first thing that has to strike you. Just, the giant, I don't know, there are a lot of sort of really large houses on the Arizona side, and you cross over and it's just, people are living in poverty, and people are working really hard to try and make a living and to eat and to feed their children. And while we were there, we got to speak to some migrant workers, some folks who had tried to cross the desert and had been deported. There are several organizations in Nogales that reach out to migrants or people who are trying to cross the border, people who have crossed and been deported. And we just heard so many stories, just stories of people who had been in the U.S. for 12 years and then sitting on his porch one day and was deported. Or people, this one kid who had been who had been raised in the U.S. and then had this crazy brush with the law in a way that it wasn't totally clear, but he ended up in Mexico where he didn't know anyone. And this husband and wife who had tried to cross together, and then the Border Patrol had actually separated them when they were caught. And her husband ended up in Juarez, and she ended up in Nogales, really far away, just separate. And they had no money, and she didn't know how to get in touch with him. It was really scary to see how people's lives were being disrupted by this border and by attempts to make a better living for themselves. Nobody really wanted to be at the border. It wasn't anybody's best option. It wasn't anybody's sort of dream, but it ended up being their dream. It ended up being the thing that they had to do in order to not be living in absolute poverty. And so yeah, that was difficult, and it was something that really made us on this trip start to look at, what are the issues that are facing people in Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador that that makes them have to leave a community that they'd rather not leave, a community where they would much rather stay. They'd rather stay with their children or stay with their connections, stay with the landscape they know and the resources that they've grown up with, but it's not an option. So it seems important to me, I guess, right now to be thinking about the way that this is being shaped in discourse, the way that we talk about it publicly. I heard somebody last week who's done some immigration work in Canada talk about newcomers, and that's the word that is used in Canada to describe immigrants. Here we use immigrant or migrant, and how is that different, and what does that mean? How does that shape what we think about the people that fit under that label? And some of the ways that I'm trying to incorporate these things that I learned at the border is by supporting the Immokalee workers who came and marched here last Sunday. They came up from Florida. A lot of them crossed through the desert to go to Florida to pick tomatoes and other vegetables, which are then distributed all over the country to Stop and Shop and Trader Joe's and Whole Foods. And those folks who are picking those tomatoes have not gotten a raise since 1980. The official statistic is that in order to make Florida's minimum wage, the migrant workers in Immokalee need to pick 2.5 tons of tomatoes a day in order to make like $7.25 an hour. So I guess for me, it's very important that I've had a shift from 5 years ago in that I see the Immokalee workers' issues as my issues. I don't see the divide that I used to, or it's much more immediate to me than it was. And I guess that's how I see standing on the side of love playing out in my life and in the activities that I'm trying to undertake. It's a new sense of solidarity for me. It's a new sense of, I don't know, being an ally to communities that have less power. Yeah, so, let me see. Is that about it? Okay, thank you. Thanks.
There's been a lot to take in, but I'm sure that there are also a lot of questions. So I'm wondering, I want to just open it up for comfort. My hope is that we can have a conversation that can be fairly free form in spite of our rather awkward arrangement of seating. So I want to just thank everyone for sharing and invite questions, comments. Tom?
Are you all suggesting that we allow anybody to come into this country? And if not, what is the solution?
Okay, I can start it off. You know, that's a tough question, but it's a good question. And I think we need to begin by asking ourselves, what are the reasons why people come here? And did we have a role in creating the conditions that pushed people from their countries? What was the role of the United States in Central America in the 1980s? What was the role of the United States in the destruction of the Mexican economy in the 1990s? We as citizens, should we take responsibility of that? So I think these questions need to inform what the solution must be. The other thing is, industries throughout the United States love a cheap and vulnerable and disposable workforce. Not only the Immokalee workers and agribusiness, but we have whole sorts of low-wage industries in the lower end of construction, the lower end of healthcare, services such as hotel and restaurants, which depend on a cheap and vulnerable workforce. And without any union protections or being organized by a worker center, industries can get away with exploiting these workers. So we need to ask those questions. Who's benefiting?
Yeah, I would add to that just, acknowledging, it seems important to acknowledge the system because the system is able to exploit because it's invisible, because the folks who are part of the system are not supposed to be here. And so to me, that's a question that we have to deal with. We can't pretend that folks, and as they raise their voices, we are forced to contend with the fact that people are here who are not supposed to be here. And so I would say just drawing acknowledgement of the system that's already in place to me is really important. Does that answer your question, or not quite?
Not really, but I mean, we still haven't solved anything unless you educate everybody that way.
I used to live in Arizona. I lived there for 10 years, my early 20s, and so I listened to the political debate back and forth about Central American people coming across the border, and I'm in the construction industry, so I get to see how that affected the construction industry. And we're talking about sort of displaced workers who come just seeking to eke out a living. Who wouldn't do that? If I was down there and there was nothing for me to work and I had to support a family, I'd do the very same thing. But at the same time, as migrant workers or people who hope to come to this country come over, that affects the workforce here. And so then we have native people who are displaced from their work. And so there's an immediate effect upon the American population. And I don't know if there's an easy answer for that. I don't know that even in our capitalistic system that demands increased expansion all the time to be able to accept the workload. I don't know that can continue. And right now, as I understand, there's like 1.6 million people who come to this country every year. And especially given these economic times when the world is sort of going through a recession, and there's not a lot of work here for a lot of people who are here. It's probably, and I'm not saying it's any less worse in another country, but it just adds a lot of more burden to the social services that are in this country. And so, as you talk,
resistance to the idea, I think. It adds to the resistance.
So I don't see that there's an easy answer to this. In fact, if there wasn't, well, why should life even have an easy answer? And I think that's why there has been no legislation that any silver bullet that can be put forth to make things work for everyone. What America is known, I think, for being a generous and caring nation. But how much burden can we take upon ourselves? The certain standard of living that we all come to appreciate here. By more people coming into our country who are looking for work. I remember when the NAFTA got passed, I thought to myself, this is a race to the bottom. And 4 different American presidents on both sides of the aisle stood up and said, yes, this is good for our country. And I just thought to myself, how come the labor unions in our country didn't stand up and yell? And so on one hand, our country is exporting work abroad. And so there's less work for people who are in our country. And then on the other hand, there are migrants who want to come into our country and look for work, making even less work for the people who live here. So it's just a very difficult problem.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the companies, the owners of the companies hiring them at a cheaper rate, knowing that they will work for that. So it's not necessarily them, it's us, or it's the people doing the owners of the companies.
That's the race to the bottom. That's everyone who goes to Walmart.
I'm not sure, though, if statistically they take our jobs statement or perception actually plays out. That it's jobs that otherwise would be taken by U.S. citizens. Gabriel, do you have stats on that? I can't pull them right now. But
there's tons of studies that could fill this room that show that immigrant labor is not displacing native-born workers. However, there is the downward pressure on wages is coming from unscrupulous companies that exploit undocumented labor. That's where the downward pressure is coming from. And a solution to that, and I'm not saying this is a simple solution, would be to extend full labor rights to everybody working in every industry so that you can have an even playing field, so that people have to respect, industries have to respect what the prevailing wages are. That industries have to respect health and safety standards at the job, so that all workers, regardless of status, can enjoy union benefits if they choose to become members of a union. And this is one way in which we could level the playing field and stop the downward pressure on wages. And the downward pressure on wages are coming in from the lower end of these industries, of construction, of the quote-unquote unskilled, unlicensed construction, the unskilled, unlicensed healthcare providers, and etc. So it's not an easy solution I offer, but again, when we rush to pass legislation that further punishes immigrants and communities, working people, mothers, and etc., that is not a solution either.
If I could just add, I find it really encouraging in the Boston area that unions largely are not seeing immigrant workers as a threat or an enemy anymore. longer. Like, I see a lot of collaboration that's happening. And to me, that's a huge improvement. Like in Texas in the 30s and 40s, you know, there were the white unions, and there were the Latino unions, and there were the black unions, and like they were not able to cooperate because they kept seeing each other as undercut and as sort of separate labor forces. But I feel like I see more inclination to accept immigrant workers within the existing union systems, which I think is important, and it's about time. And so also, I wanted to bring up a temp workers bill that is happening right now that I think is important, that is directed at people who, day laborers largely. I mean, it would also affect temp workers, but basic protections like knowing where you're going for the day, knowing who your supervisor is, knowing how much you're going to be paid for the day. And so that's something that I've worked in temp jobs before, and that's something that I always got through a temp agency. But if you're picked up in the street at 4 in the morning and it's dark and you don't quite know where you're going all day and you're not clear on the terms of your agreement, I mean so this bill is going up in the Massachusetts Senate right now. And so that's something I think is really important.
I'd like to know.
I want to add a little bit on what you're saying. I don't have much knowledge about the immigration. I know immigration is very important. And there are people came here legally or illegally, and there are many peoples over 10, 20 years even here documented illegally. First of all, what we need to know is when people leave their country, there are so many different reasons. In our case, it's life and death. I survive, or whatever the circumstances, whatever is the consequence. Once they came here, you know, there are so many different reasons. United States opened the door for everybody to come. Some even they invite them, like they give them legally. They brought them for work. The Native Americans couldn't do that. It's given to foreigners. But in another instance, the low people that we are talking, like in our case, people, older people, have no education, nothing. They don't blindly, when they leave the country, life and death is the question. And now what we're seeing here is, am I going to sit down and say, oh, you came here illegally, I don't care, whatever? I can't say that. This person has no choice. They have no choice when they came to this world. They're living, they're looking for a better tomorrow. They don't come here to rob. They don't come here to, they just, like me and you, to have a better life, to have a better, it's unfortunately, I mean, United States cannot accommodate for everyone, but the system, they have to do something. Something has to be done, you know, for a big country, fortunate like this. We are saying, we're asking, there should be a better system, mutually, for those people less fortunate. For example, we have tons of people from Eritrea now. In fact, we are talking about the higher end. There are people, they don't speak the language, they don't know nothing. In fact, last week, a bunch of them, I took them, like they're frustrating sitting, what are we going to do now? We are here. They feed us, we're surviving. So we're trying to, we have English as a second language. We give them, you know, even from scratch, ABCD, we teach them. And anything from scratch they're willing to do, like about 4 weeks ago, this brutal snow, heavy snow, we took them to downtown to clean. They are willing to do that. The question is, these people come here to do anything, to pick up, to live, to learn. But again, the immigration has its own agenda, its own problem. Unfortunately, we are in recession now. But as human beings, we can't just sit down and look. You know, when people are dying, when people are just, you know, those less fortunate people, they can, as much as we can, we have to support and do what we can do.
I'm struck by, sorry, I'm just going to make a comment now. I'm struck by how much the public rhetoric has benefited from a narrowing of the terms of the conversation, so that that question of immigration just is what happens at the border, and not about those larger economic factors that are driving both the reasons for migration and the anxieties that are experienced by people who are struggling with the failing economy on this side of the border. And wonder, I remember reading in the news about the latest efforts at, building the fence and the billions of dollars that was going to cost, and just couldn't help but wonder how could that money be used to develop, cooperative workers, industries in Central American countries to keep people. Nobody wants to come here. They don't really want to come. Nobody wants to leave their family. What they want is gainful employment and an ability to make a decent life. And how, it's amazing to me and not amazing to me. It makes one question who is benefiting from the fact that this is made into a military question of protecting borders rather than how can we be better neighbors? What is our duty to one another, and what is how are we already implicated in what this problem is?
It's really interesting that when we were in Arizona, just talking to the migrants, everything was about how they didn't want to leave home, but they had to, and there was this pull to the wealth. There was pull to just, we'll take anything, we can get. And then we went and we visited the American consulate in Nogales, Mexico, and everything that they were saying was about how to. Just sort of, everybody wants to come, we have to keep everybody out. And we asked about the militarization of the border. And they were really confused by that phrase. They didn't understand in the consulate what militarization of the border meant. The fact that there are people patrolling back and forth with guns all the time. The fact that the week we went there, kids got shot for throwing rocks. Like the idea, and this is a new development. This is a post-911 development. It's a post-NAFTA development. It's that there's so much firepower directed at Mexico.
So I was going to comment. I might not have heard you correctly, Steve, but I think that there was a little comment slid in there that I've heard many times about how immigrant populations come here and use our social welfare systems. I don't know that you were directly saying that.
I can say that.
Okay. My experience of people accessing social welfare systems is that if they are undocumented, they can't get the services. And I think Kye was talking about being on border and seeing, wealth on one side and abject poverty on the other. And I think that it behooves us to remember that many undocumented workers here in the United States are starving. And it's not just about the militarization of the borders, it's about people coming here trying to make a new day for themselves and then finding that they can't even eat here. And I wonder what we can do as a community to try to address the needs of people within this broader community, especially around things like access to food and shelter. I know that most of the Boston area food banks require you to show some sort of social security card in order to get food. Do you have thoughts on food and shelter and the needs of undocumented workers here around those things?
A lot of those services are provided by community-based organizations in terms of food banks. People come and donate cans of food and dry goods and etc. And it's distributed by the community-based organization. But I do want to emphasize the point that you made earlier, and that is, since 1996, undocumented persons in this country cannot access any federal benefit whatsoever. So when we hear things that they come here to get on welfare, well, it's impossible. You just can't do it. Another point is that they come here to take our jobs. It wasn't the immigrant that decided to outsource good manufacturing jobs to Indonesia, Nicaragua, and China. That wasn't their decision. The other thing is that, there's really good studies on the contributions of immigrant communities to the local tax coffers, but also to the federal government. Even undocumented workers who draw a paycheck have deductions taken from those paychecks. Some of those deductions are the FICA. And when the Social Security Administration cannot match a name with a Social Security number, that money goes into something that's called the Social Security Earnings Suspense File. In 2003, the money in the Earnings Suspense File was up to $374 billion. Yeah. And that's money that these immigrants will never see because they're undocumented.
They earned it, but they won't receive it.
They won't receive it because they can't, because they have a phony Social Security number.
And what happens to that money?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I don't know. Ask your elected officials.
So I work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I have people come into the office and ask for how many how many people are undocumented workers, and I say them they're undocumented. But there's a lot of research on the aging of the American workforce and economic studies that have been done on the necessary work of the immigrant labor force, because we have a lot of people that are going to be 60 years old in the United States, and not so many people that are young enough to work and take care of them and pay into Social Security so that they can draw. And that it may not be as much of an economic problem as has been put forth.
Mm-hmm. I'm just struck by bringing it back to an earlier thing that you said, Parisa, about the human-to-human connection, and how in this issue it's easy to go back into the political or the legal state, and yet in my own community of Dorchester, I see people sort of skirting, for better or worse, this issue all the time, because we have a huge Irish immigration population there that is largely here illegally, and yet they get off of the plane and they know right where to go, and they know if I go here, I'm going to stay over, there'll be a place for me to stay, and there'll be a guy who comes by and picks me, and within 2 weeks I'll be connected to housing, I'll be connected to all these other things. And it's because somebody here views them as like me, and so they're not that interested, or they don't care, for better or worse, not saying that's a good thing, but just there are people here who see those people and say, I'll help you find your way in. I relate to you. You're like my grandfather when he came here, or you're like my cousin, And so there's a human to human connection that seems to bypass. And so I can't help but wonder, you mentioned before about in Arizona about the racist component and other things. How much of this is just looking at people and saying, you're not like me, you're somebody else, you're different because of your color, because of your language, because of your religion. And if this discourse is really universally about immigration, or if it's about the immigration of people who seem different than the people who are already here, and if we need to get into that level of trying to break down those walls. So I'm just curious to see if, do you see it as being more targeted towards people, who are not white, don't speak English as a first language, versus, is it really just about immigration?
I was born in this country. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I've been asked about 7 times in travels for my papers within the United States. There was a study done by the National Lawyers Guild, I forget exactly when, I think it was 2005, that showed the the detention and deportation rates of the national origins of people in the greater Boston area. The highest was Dominican, the second highest was Guatemalan. And if you look at the immigration statistics, that is skewed. No way are the Dominicans and Guatemalans just, overrepresent the immigrant population in the greater Boston area. I used to live in Brighton. I know when we used to go to Irish pubs, certain people that were at the bar were not have papers, but it was accepted.
It seems to me that what I keep coming back to is that currently the discourse is driven by fear. On all fronts. You spoke earlier, Mr. Camacho, about the progressive politicians who are talking to develop a more enlightened immigration policy. You were talking about 4 pillars, and I wasn't sure. Do you support those 4 pillars? You don't.
Absolutely not.
It sounds to me like they do. Have you got an idea about a different set of pillars? Because it seems to me that part of what needs to happen in order for the fear factor to go down is for some kind of middle ground of comprehensive reform to begin to come into play that will reduce fear on both sides and allow for more dialogue. Because frankly, I think part of what happens at some levels is that some people, at least in this country, will think, well, if people can simply come to the door of our country and walk in and say, I want to sit down at the table here, people begin to think about, well, somebody could come to the door of my house and walk in and say, I want to sit down at the table here. I think that's a piece of the fear that connects to people who already have something and are afraid. So some kind of set of pillars that will work would seem to me to be where the conversation needs to begin. And I haven't heard yet about specific legislative proposals that can begin to be debated. Because, I don't think most people in this room think that this problem is going to be solved by extending the wall all the way across the southern United States.
Yeah, well, I could try to begin to answer that by saying that I think we need to start a discussion on basing comprehensive immigration reform on human rights, recognizing that people have inalienable rights and they should be respected no matter where they are and where they come from. The other thing is that I think we also need to challenge the toxic narrative out there that immigrants are terrorists, immigrants are criminals, immigrants come and take our jobs. And there's actually tons of studies and good statistics out there that prove it. However, no matter, even if you're armed with facts and have a well-reasoned argument, it's not going to change the minds of many politicians. So we need a political campaign or a campaign such as Stand on the Side of Love that recognizes the humanity of everybody. And I think that's one way to begin to broach that subject. Now, on specific policy recommendations, the AFSC has a document on its website called New Paths, and I helped write sections 1 and 2 of it. But it has principles and specific policy recommendations. I have no problem with people who that before crossing borders should show some form of ID and register somewhere. That sounds reasonable to me. Sometimes, the AFSC is accused of, oh, that's the open borders, fashion, and it's not true at all.
And there's also in Arizona there is this thing that was being thrown around that Gabriel Giffords was actually sort of interested in pushing forward, which is the idea that somebody could come in and do a guest worker program in which that costs about $2,500, which is the going rate for Ecoyote, if you're going to have someone accompany you through the desert. What I understand, as of, I don't know, January, you might pay about $2,500. That would cost that much, but then would end up, and there would be like a 10% wage sort of, I don't know, garnishment, like you'd keep your wages until you cross back over.
We're not welcome here, we don't belong here, why we're treated this way, human nature. Again, it depends. But from year to year, the Eritrean case is different. From the story I was mentioning, it's such different from like the Mexico, the other border, what driven many Eritreans to leave the country. I can tell you, there's no one single Eritrean, they don't want to leave, they love their country, they can do anything. They fought 30 years to get their independence and to be what they want to be. Unfortunately, things weren't like that, and they're forced to leave the country. In another way, there are a lot of Eritreans, very educated, very successful here. They know what they're doing. They have the dream of America. They became good citizens. In fact, many of Eritreans now that Cynthia saw, the Eritrean Center, that's how we begin. We create that center to give them, to teach them, what America looks like. It's much better to hear it from us than the Native Americans. Again, I would like to thank American. God bless American. Again, I would say that this is more opportunities, and people say that again and again. But nobody wants to leave home. There's no place like home, sweet home. But there are people, grandmother, my great, who wants to be here. They don't speak the language. They're lonely. They stay home all day. They would rather to be, back home. But it's just because of the circumstances. It's the question of life and death. At least I'm living, I'm surviving. One day they'll say, I'll go back. So, of course, people from one to another, they differ. There are people now when they get frustrated, we don't belong here, they don't treat us this, and when they don't find a job, there's so many problems. In fact, the problem lately is the people there fleeing now, they don't speak English, they're older, they get frustrated. I mean, if it wasn't this, I wouldn't leave my country. What am I going to do now without talking in English? What can they do here? So learning, for an elder, like 40, 50 elderly women or men, teaching them now and to become a workforce, it's so difficult. It's sad they will be burdened, but we're trying to find a way. That center, group of Eritreans that they've been lived here longer with the support of many humanitarian Americans like you, with their help, we're trying to adjust, make them live, at least to feed themselves and survive.
Could one of the panelists share with us what the Standing on the Side of Love campaign is all about? Some of the viewers at home don't know what that's all about.
Sure. It's a Unitarian Universalist. I guess it's sort of a political campaign in a way, but not really. It's a way of approaching political issues. It's a way of being in the public sphere as Unitarian Universalists. And the key to our faith, as I see it, and as we talk about it, is the inherent worth and dignity of each person. And so the key to standing on the side of love is to look at each issue with that as our lens, the inherent worth and dignity of each person. So when it comes to gay marriage, that is the lens that we want to look at. That issue with. And when it comes to immigration, we don't want to picture people as, we want to look at everyone's immigrant worth of dignity. And so that has meant supporting the student immigrant movement, coming out to some of their events and asking them to come to our church and speak to our folks. That has meant going out and supporting the Immokalee workers. That meant a group of people going and getting civil disobedience training in Phoenix. And there were a lot of people that were arrested that day in solidarity with the folks who were being affected directly by SB 1070. So yeah, I don't know, maybe this is a little romantic, but I think of it as participating in the civil rights movement in the 60s and being there for people who need us, and that has a direct effect on how I see my country and how I see my faith, and the willingness to stand with folks who may not have voices, or who may be trying to find their voices, or who may be fighting large forces that don't want them to be speaking. That's where I think I need to be, and I'm really happy that you use her there.
Cynthia? A lot of these questions are hard to answer. It's a very big issue that can be frustrating. One of you asked, well, what can we do? And in Milton, there are 4 churches: the Church of Our Savior, First Parish, the Congregational Church next door in St. Elizabeth's, and we have formed a group called Milton Interfaith Refugee Assistance Program, MIFR for short. And we have met with a group of Haitian women. It's called AFAB in Dorchester, and a lot of you have donated toiletries and food. What we have started to do, we've just made a connection with Ruth's program, the Eritrean, I always say that, Eritrean Community Center, and you have seen articles in the paper asking for donations. You all have donated money, so we have a new sewing machine that Ruth Hannon has bought, and a couple of the other churches have had sewing machines donated and material. So what we're going to be doing is starting sewing classes, and a lot of according to what Ruth and her board told us, a lot of people are despondent, they don't have anything to do, and they're feeling frustrated, and there's a lot of psychological trauma going on there. So we're thinking that we'll start with small projects, and eventually it could be a way to make crafts that could be sold possibly at churches and whatnot. Also, they have community gardens, and some of you might know across the bridge in Mattapan, over to the left on River Street, they teach immigrant populations how to grow their own food. They give them raised beds and the seeds so that they can grow vegetables, some tomatoes and whatnot, but also vegetables they can't get here that are from their country. Too often, I just learned that people many of the immigrants who come here are going to McDonald's and Burger King because of limited funds, and they don't have the knowledge of nutrition that we Americans had pounded into our heads for so long. But at any rate, so I will be putting something in the newspaper about donations for tools, shovels and rakes, and they have soil and whatnot, and I know there are a lot of gardeners, so those are little tiny ways we can help. I don't know what the answer is for the border. I was reading the book that you recommended, the death of Yoseline, and it's so complicated. But I'm just saying that there are little ways that we can help. At least it's doing something.
At this moment, I will take the opportunity to say thank you to each and everyone. Any little thing would be very beneficial, very helpful. And that's one thing we want to do. We don't want them to be a burden. They come to America, be creative. And the gardening project, the city of Boston started for refugees like from Sudan, Somalia, like 7-8 refugees. I'm one of the coordinators, like 5-6 hours a week. I coordinate those refugees. We have like now 3 raised beds in the community center. One day when I coordinate, I would like to invite everyone to come and see. What we're trying to do is to those people, they arrive trying to make them busy, raise their own, most of them are farmers. We're trying to ask like seeds and good soils, and they grow their own plants. And then in Dorchester, they're giving like certain lots for people they're willing to do it. Then they grow their own plants, and at least they save some money to make, all that kind of food. In the meantime, they eat healthy food, organic. They grow and they make themselves busy, and that way they interact, they learn so many things. And I would like to thank everyone for the help you did.
I just wanted to go back to a comment from before about the sort of toxic nature around immigration. And there was a phrase you used that raised a flag for me, because I thought to myself, I don't feel like it's toxic enough in some ways. I feel like we're able to, our kids in school learn this sort of melting pot idea and everything around immigration, with the babushkas and the, it seems the Statue of Liberty. I grew up in New Jersey, so it's romanticized, and we get away from this working rights, labor rights, and human rights core of the issue. My husband works in labor, and the labor movement is dying. It's dying on the vine. So we're not even really addressing that. The huge difference in wages and compensation, and the growing rift between the wealthy and the poor. People making minimum wage in this country are barely able to survive. So I feel like these are not conversations that we're really having, and because it's inconvenient. And I liken it to when I'm with my sister, and she always has great fruit out for her kids, and I'm trying not to buy fruit because I'm trying not to buy anything that's not local, and I don't know where it's coming from. But it's very inconvenient, and I feel like I don't feel supported. And she kind of rolls her eyes, and I feel that that's the general feeling out there, like, oh boy, here we go again. This is a pain, and I don't want to think on this level. And that is what I think is very quietly toxic instead of an outward toxicity. If that makes sense, I don't know.
It does make sense. There's various levels out there. There are people who want to, put their head in the sand and avoid this issue altogether because they're not affected. Yet the fear that was mentioned before, it's very real. I mean, a lot of working class people, white working class people, don't understand why good manufacturing jobs left this country. A lot of white working class people do see people who look like me moving in, working in other sectors. And this does create misunderstandings and fear. And this is why oftentimes you have to find scapegoats. You have to blame it all, blame crime on the immigrants, blame the budget deficits on unions. It wasn't the immigrant population that dealt with, highly toxic, Wall Street instruments. And these are issues that are very hard to talk about. It's difficult to say that it is, the CEOs of this country and the Wall Street bankers that drove this country almost into the abyss. And it's not the immigrant who's trying to survive that's responsible for that. It's hitting us in various different levels, this issue. And, we need to have these conversations. We may not be all on the same page, and we may never will be all on the same page. But to begin to have intelligent conversations, conversations that may be scary, that may bring out some fear, is important. But, for God's sakes, let's not leave it all to Lou Dobbs and Glenn Beck and AM talk radio hosts. This is where you fit in.
It seems to me that that's part of what the Standing on the Side of Love campaign is. It's not all direct action and going and getting arrested, though that's cool too. But it's also about learning how to start having those conversations and being willing to take a stance as a UU to say, this is what's happening politically in our country, this is what's happening to the people around us, and this is how we can make a difference with our dollars and our votes, right? And that's all part of that. I think I would probably call it an initiative. You were looking for a word there earlier. And I think this church is having some conversation about how we can do that in a social justice sphere. Parisa, do you have any ideas about that?
Well, the Social Action Committee is now in the process of working through some great but wide-ranging ideas about a focus that we can kind of have as an umbrella for the work that we do going forward. So we're in conversation about that. But we have participated just a couple of weeks ago. We were at the Monthly Workers at River Circle and have been part of different parts of the Standing on the Side of Love campaign. I want to I think we're kind of drawing to conclusion, and I want to say that our faith takes it as a given that each and every person is our neighbor, and that we are called to, if we don't initially see the connection, we are called to cultivate it and to, in this lifetime, build a better world than we see before us. So as we walk with those questions, I'm wondering if we can leave this evening with some concrete ideas of ways that we can be involved, even if it's a conceptual shift, but some ideas for how we can move forward in educating ourselves, in becoming allies, in discovering new neighbors, in expanding the way that we think about and work on this issue, as we're in conversation with our families, as we're in conversation with coworkers, as we find ourselves at the grocery store or sitting around a corporate boardroom or wherever we are located socially. What can we do? And so I want to just ask our panelists, but also anyone who's here, about just one thing that you would do or feel called to, even if you don't quite know how to do it yet. I'm going to ask Kye, what would you have folks do?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, so talking to a group of UUs, I feel like we really have to do a lot of investigation. As a UU, I always need to really delve into something to understand, what does this mean for me? I need to make sure that I looked at a lot of sides of the issue. Because the whole point of us being here, I think, the reason that I am a member of this church is because it encourages me to think. It's a path of questioning and asking questions. So let me see, one thing. I mean, don't be afraid to ask those questions. And, I guess going back to the radio thing that I was talking about before that conversation, if you hear people making assumptions, ask. See, why do you assume that? Or why do you think that? Or can we get into a deeper conversation about that? And, you know, maybe that won't lead to productive, life-changing something for the other person, but like that listening in that process and that centered asking, you know, why do you think that? Or is that an assumption you're making? Can I learn something from this exchange? I just think that's really important, rather than letting that stuff go under the radar, which is often easier if it doesn't seem like it has an immediate impact. You know, so yeah. That's what I'd say.
As an individual, the first thing is love, like you said, and I will do what I can do. Of course, I will continue to learn. I will continue to look, ask, as she mentioned. Do what I can do. Do the right thing. That's what I believe I will continue to do. The most important is, as you all mentioned, how can we bring a better society? How can all be addressed, resolved? It's not only the politicians' issue, it's not only one individual group, all together as a team. And as me, if everybody thinks that way, I hope change will come in for a better or positive. That's how I think.
I was thinking of what's that one thing I can ask people here to do. First thing that came to my mind was, well, join Centro Presentes campaign against secure communities. But, you know, and then I was thinking about the community gardens project. And many immigrants come from rural areas, and, you know, the soil and agriculture is so much a part of their culture, their metaphors, that something like that goes a long way to break people out of that alienation, to make people feel productive and meaningful again. And that's a beautiful thing. But I think the one thing I would ask you all to do is when you hear something and you know deep down in your heart and in your intellect that that's just wrong, challenge it. That's how we're going to change this.
There's something that we haven't talked about today that has to do with faith, and this is about how we respond in faith to this situation. And I just wanted to name the fact that I think that there are a lot of Christian organizations out there who are fighting against illegal immigration. And if not organizations, churches, and certainly the Christian right. And I think as people of faith, we need to counter that message, because I think that the religion of Jesus counters that message. And so to ground our own response in our universalist message of faith, grounded in the Christian scriptures, I think is a good way to at least come to the table and dialogue in an interfaith way about this issue.
Steve?
Something that Julia mentioned before, and I'm thinking about my, my first wife. When I was back in California, she started a Girl Scout troop, and several of the girls in her troop spoke broken English, and their parents didn't speak English. And she noticed sort of a problem of communication in it, and she decided that she was going to help them with English, and she found out where local classes were for English as a second language. And in regards to America as the melting pot, if the people who come to this country want to become Americans, the first thing you have to do is you have to learn English, or else you're going to be considered apart from this country. So I think I should probably know what the English as a second language classes are, where they are locally, so I can pass that on.
There's a library.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
There are English for ESOL classes everywhere, like ENB, English for New Bostonians. It's funded by different organizations, especially the city of Boston. That's how we get the fund, and we teach English as a second language once a week, and we have different, aside Eritreans, we have Haitian and some different background students. But there is, in every community, English as a second language. Yes, definitely, that's the first thing that we need to do.
There are also ways to volunteer with those programs teaching English, and
totally.
Yeah, there are a lot of opportunities for first-hand contact with people who have just arrived, and that Thomas Merton talks about that as like the more involved you get in a cause, the less you start, the less you're fighting for an idea, and the more you're actually fighting for an individual person. So that one-to-one contact could also be very meaningful.
A friend of mine is a Unitarian Universalist in Arizona, and he gave me a button and it says, "I could be illegal." And I was just imagining, I haven't been to Arizona, but I was just wondering, I could just imagine thousands of people wearing these, especially people who, are white people who look like they're Americans and wouldn't be questioned and wouldn't be asked for papers. And I don't know if they're wearing them down there, and I've thought about wearing it, but I hesitate. I'm not sure where that hesitation is, and I have to think about it some more. But it would be, if you want to engage people with conversation, if you had something like that on your backpack or on your jacket, certainly would, I think, make people come up and ask you what that was all about.
That would be a compelling thing for a whole community to do, and then come back and reflect on what the experience was. Right? I mean,
and it does say UUA on the bottom of it, so in small print. But I think that whoever thought of that was ingenious and it's thought-provoking.
I think that's akin to what Heather was saying earlier too, that, and I don't think that you very specifically used these words, but I think we have to be actively anti-racist, because this is an issue of racism. And I don't have answers on all of the ways that we can do that, but I know that we've already had some conversations, again, in this congregation about how to engage in conversations that aren't just brushing an issue under the carpet.
Well, I pray that we all will find ways to live and practice our faith in ways that are both organic to us and also push us beyond the internal borders that we've created around activism or reaching out in connection, and take some risks to be advocates, to be witnesses, and to be builders of solidarity and crossers of borders, so that we might discover new ways of being and living through this issue, and hopefully be part of some constructive solutions. So I give great thanks to all of you who came to speak this evening. I really appreciate the time that you spent with us and the selves that you have shared with us, and I'm grateful. So thanks everyone for being here.